in the chat box. Let you know that we are recording this today, so we will have it up on the CBTS YouTube website within a matter of a week or two. It depends on with the holiday schedule, but certainly something that if you missed something or you want to get a little more, remember something or a response, you'll have a chance to go back and look at that. So many of you know Dr. Gerstein. He is a senior policy researcher at the RAND Corporation, was the acting undersecretary and deputy undersecretary for Science and Technology Directorate, and has extensive civil and military service in support of Homeland Security issues, but also other types of counterterrorism, humanitarian, and certainly even seen combat in his roles over the years. So with that, I want to turn it over to Dan, but maybe the first question I'd like to get out on the table is, what got you interested in writing this book in the first place?
Well, first, Greg, let me thank you and the Center for inviting me to come back. I'm very much looking forward to talking about tech wars. Picking up on your question, that's a great place to start. And in fact, it's one of the chapters in the book, one of the early chapters. And I call these the recent skirmishes. And let me describe a couple of these. They're really interesting. The first one that always comes to mind is North Korea and their ability to build missile systems and to build nuclear technology, nuclear weapons, despite having extraordinary sanctions put on them. And it just struck me that, here's North Korea with all of these sanctions, and yet they're able to develop an intercontinental ballistic missile capability with a warhead that could strike the United States, or at least we believe that they could strike the United States. And so that was one of the skirmish lines that I saw. Another one that's really interesting is when you think about the 2016 election and all of the different attempts that were made to affect the outcome of the 2016 election. It's not clear that any of them necessarily had great effect, but it was the idea that people were attempting to use their technologies, cyber technologies, social media technologies, in order to put out false narratives and change the election in some way. Again, not clear exactly how successful people were, but it's interesting to contemplate that. And then, another one that was absolutely fascinating to me was the 5G experience. That is, the cellular system that went from 4G, the LTE model that we had for a number of years, and then we started thinking about fielding 5G or fifth generation of cellular technology. And to understand how damning this was, we almost lost the race to 5G to China. And it was only at the very end when we were able to convince people of the vulnerabilities of a Chinese system that would be fielded. And so we were able to turn the corner. But why did we get to that point? And it really goes back, very interestingly, to the selection of the waveform, the part of the spectrum that we chose. The Chinese chose a lower end of the spectrum. And in that spectrum, the wave travels further. It's not as efficient at carrying information. But if you have a longer wave, it means you need less base stations. In other words, the Chinese were going to be able to field a capability that was probably 2 to 3 times less cost than what the US solution was going to be. And why did we get there? Well, it turns out the part of the spectrum that we wanted to use was called millimeter wave, and it's much more efficient at carrying data, but that's part of the spectrum that was being used by the military and by law enforcement. And so not wanting to interfere with military and law enforcement activities, operations, the decision was made that we would go with the higher part of, we would go with this higher part of the spectrum, which would have been much more costly. And so you wonder, how did we get to that point? Even the Department of Defense now acknowledges that, that impacted on the effect or the cost of this system. And what's the side benefit that it would have given us? Well, there's a $3 trillion handset market for 5G. And if it had gone to the Chinese, that would have been a pretty substantial hit to the economy. And so when we think about technologies, it's not just looking at what their benefit is to single actors, as important as they are, Department of Defense or law enforcement, but it's also looking at what it brings in terms of economic prosperity. And so these tech skirmishes got me very interested in thinking about how can we better organize ourselves to make sure that we are making proper decisions about the technologies that we're using, the ones that we're developing, and how we think about what their effect will be globally.
Great, thank you. And it's interesting on kind of a choice of words. Kind of early in the book, you discuss whether to call this this technology competition, conflict, or a war. You ended up with wars. Can you give me an idea of how you settled on calling it a tech war?
Well, you pointed out I have a military background.
Yeah.
So one of the things I'll just say is that, I've been schooled on the lessons of Karl von Clausewitz. And what Clausewitz said, he was a military strategist who wrote at the time of Napoleon, actually a handful of years after, but he observed what had gone on in the Napoleonic Wars. And he gave us this maxim that war was an extension of politics. And so I started to think about which would make more sense, to call it a competition, a conflict, or a war. And I settled on war because I think there are elements of the entire spectrum that are embedded in this. The 5G feels to me like a war. I mean, it felt like a very significant outcome. But there are other parts, such that feel much more like just a normal competition that is very important that we win and compete well in. But I didn't see them necessarily as being warlike, and so I chose that also to say this is a very, very urgent competition that we are facing. And I just used the competition word, but we really have to understand that even small decisions, like in the spectrum, amount to very big outcomes. And so making the appropriate decisions is very important.
Good. Thank you. Again, folks, if you you could either raise your hands or just unmute and then come on. But as we go along, I know you've kind of laid out with some of the examples of China and North Korea, but how would you describe kind of the path that we've taken to get to this point in the United States, in terms of how we are hit with this tension at this point in time?
Yeah, so when you think about the United States and our science and technology enterprise, and I use the term enterprise to describe the United States, and I use ecosystem to talk about the global S&T work that nations do. And I sort of segregated in that way to be able to think about, how this enterprise actually was developed. And you really have to go back to in and around the period of World War II. And you think about the technologies that were developed just prior to the war or even during the course of the war. You think about what we learned about having a connected model of research and development. Connected meaning it was connected to the operational missions, that is winning the war. And so when we think about that, we had this debate coming out of the war about should we have a connected model or should we have a disconnected model? And we settled on the connected model. What's the problem with that? Well, if you have a connected model, it means you're not taking risks. You're not looking at questions like quantum physics years before you're going to ever have any return on investment. And so the idea was that we needed to find a way to have both sides represented. Those operational issues that absolutely needed to be solved and to make better operational capacities are very important. But we also needed to take risks and do things that others might not fund. So for us, we turned the corner. It was the Sputnik moment in 1957 when the Soviet Union launched the first artificial satellite. And we realized that we were behind in research and development in our science and technology capacity. And so as of that time, we set in place the momentum that would carry us through to where we are today. That is that we have a role for the federal government. We have industry, which has become really the center of mass of the science and technology. We have academia, which is responsible and does a terrific job in sort of the basic and applied research and early development activities. And so those entities and some other smaller players are very important to this enterprise. But what's also happened is that the government back in the 50s and 60s, the federal government, was the biggest funder of research and development. And today that's greatly shifted. And so we can see the tea leaves here that if we are not careful, the government is going to lose its ability to bring forward technologies that are needed for the types of operational activities that the government's engaged in. And so finding a way to better communicate with industry and with academia to find those niche capabilities that we want to have becomes very important. What has all this given us? Well, it's given us, a preeminent place in around the globe. I mean, we have 25% of the world's wealth, but only 4% of the world's population. And, if we want to sustain, if we want to continue to grow and to build our science and technology enterprise to lead in technical areas, it means we probably need to reevaluate how we're doing business. And in the book, I actually I talk a bit about the later stages of the 21st century, that is approaching the year 2100, and thinking about what will the S&T enterprise in the United States look like at the turn of the next century. And so that's what this book is trying to do, is to deal with how should we think about these extremely complex issues that we are facing.
Awesome. Other folks with questions?
Greg, Chris here. I have a question for you. You mentioned a little bit going back to even the 50s and 60s on the federal government's role. Could you expand a little further on the role in this tech war, on their role in this tech war?
Oh, that's a super question, and it's teed up. I love that you asked that. So, because back in the 50s and 60s, the federal government was doing somewhere between 65 and 70% of the research and development, the funding for research and development. And today that number is somewhere at about 24% or so of the US funding of science and technology. And so, the question then becomes, if the government is funding such a much smaller percent, what do they invest in? And how can the government become a better consumer? And so when we think about the science and technology enterprise here in the United States, and we think about the federal role, it's useful to think about examples. I like to think about issues such as the federal highway system, which was federally funded. I like to think about the space race, which not only has put a human, a US person on the moon in 1969, but it also set the stage for a brand new industry, the space industry. And today we see the fruits of that with a number of companies that have established their credentials as space powers. And so I think about that. I also think about the internet. Think about the cyber domain, which was created by DARPA, the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency, and has now created an e-commerce enterprise, which has demonstrably created enormous wealth, not only here in the United States, but also globally. And so, those are areas, just a few, that are really important and demonstrate the federal role. So the question is, how much should the federal government, how much of a role should the federal government be playing? And what are the key areas in which the federal government can actually make a difference? And, finding those and then putting the resources toward them and incentivizing, whether it's through grants or contracts, whatever, how do we incentivize industry to move into areas that we think are essential for continuing to build capacity here in the United States?
On mute there. I'm sure there's going to be some that are going to come in there, but if you think about, again, maybe this is going back a little bit to what we covered earlier. If you think about wars as kind of having opposing states, who are the opposing forces in this tech war?
Well, the opposing forces are much different than they are in sort of a traditional war. They include a very wide swath of humanity. It includes people throughout the United States. We certainly think about the federal government, we think about industry, but I think the individual is also on the front lines of this war, even more so than we're used to. Think about social media, think about cyber, think about the latest biotech and having to decide and make choices about competing opportunities. And so, it really challenges individuals. If you want to keep up in society, you have to wind up being on the internet, but being on the internet means that you could put yourself at risk. And so, you are exposing yourself with every time you're on the internet, but you can't live without that. And social media, another case in point. And so when we think about, the front lines, that's certainly part of it. But, we also have the nations on the front lines. Every nation, virtually every nation, has understood that the United States capacity has been built on our technology, our science and technology prowess. And so they are now looking to challenge us in key areas. And there's not going to be a state necessarily outside of China who would try to challenge us on all areas that we're investing in and that we're competing in. But there is definitely it can be seen very clearly that China is working to overthrow our supremacy in certain areas. They've picked out key technologies. They've talked about it through their Made in China 2025 initiative. They want to proliferate those technologies through their Belt and Road initiative. And all of that comes together. And as it does, if the Belt and Road did what the Chinese said, they would have 66%, 2/3 of the world's population would be Belt and Road countries and populations. And so you can see how that would affect the U.S. Capacity economically, national security, partnerships and collaboration. And so very important that we think about that. You also have individuals. Some might be, actors seeking to grow business lines of business in maker spaces and labs who are working to build capacity. But some of those same people could be using the technologies for ill purposes, for nefarious purposes that could harm humanity. And, that's very important to think about, is how do we not only ensure that we're continuing to develop our capabilities, but also that we protect against bad outcomes, whether it's an accident or misuse of a technology, or if somebody is deliberately using a technology. If you think about this, 9/11 and the use of airliners as missiles gives you just one very poignant example of how any technology could be misused if we don't think about the scenarios and risks that each pose in some way.
Great. Other questions?
Yeah, hi. So this is Heather Manley, Lily Bridge with the center. So question related to what you were just talking about with China and then, with the new tech and then thinking about September 11th with, really kind of old tech using the plane as a missile. Um, just how might we discern which adversaries need the most attention and those that should gain from new advances? Just thinking that with new tech, some countries might leapfrog other countries, but then, also thinking about new ways to use old tech. I would have never thought about hijacking a plane with a box cutter either. That's about as old school as you can get.
Yeah, thanks for that question. I think that's terrific. A great place to kind of leap into. Part of what I'm calling for in the book is rethinking of the U.S. science and technology enterprise. And when I talk about rethinking, there are certain parts of our government that could be very useful in trying to help us understand the situation that's emerging, the technological situation that's emerging around the world. And one of those happens to be the Department of Commerce. And I think that, in my world, I'd like to see the Department of Commerce change a bit and become the Department of Technology and Commerce and get additional capabilities for things like science and technology intelligence and counterintelligence, the ability to do horizon scanning so that we can actually understand how certain technologies are evolving. Would we have gotten ourselves into the same trouble with 5G if we had a counterweight to the Department of Defense and law enforcement saying, this is really important that we consider, that 5G is going to be a very big deal in terms of economic capacity? Having the ability for predictive analysis and actually understanding the technology as they're maturing and being able to take more rapid action to ensure that we are at least considering the use and the misuse cases that are possible. Another one that we had that I think is very important is a net assessment capability. You might have heard about net assessment. The Department of Defense used net assessments back in the Cold War, and specifically looking at should we have a nuclear triad? And many said we should get rid of the bomber part of the triad and just keep the intercontinental ballistic missiles and those aboard submarines. And it's interesting that we did a net assessment, and the reason we kept the triad was that the part of the nuclear enterprise that developed or that delivered weapons via bombers actually was very challenging for the Soviet Union to have to deal with. And because of that, it caused them to spend a lot of money that they didn't have to defend their periphery. Now, that's a pretty interesting approach, and why a case in point as to why a net assessment can be a very useful tool in confounding adversaries. So, in my thinking about this, a lot of what's been done with the CHIPS Act is really terrific. I mean, it's the sort of way which we should be going, but we need to do more. And part of that more, I think you'll recognize that the CHIPS Act is a little bit of an industrial policy light. And that's, I think, what I would suggest, and what I do suggest in the book, is that we need to have some sort of industrial policy which helps us not pick individual winners and losers, but find those areas, those technology, science and technology areas, which are absolutely essential to getting this right in the future. And as I was saying that, I noticed that somebody came up and said, the CHIPS Act only scratches the surface. And to that, I say, I absolutely agree. It is a small down payment. But what I hope comes out of it is the notion that government can have a role in promoting key technologies. The other thing with the CHIPS Act is that we're not going to see these foundries for quite some time, 3 to 5 years at the earliest. But, it gets us thinking about, the sorts of ways in which science and technology can be influenced and how the private sector, to include industry and academia, can be incentivized to really delve into key science and technology areas. So, when I think about this problem, that's kind of the direction that I go.
Yeah, thank you. Other questions?
Dan, this is Bob Newman from DHS Science and Technology, your old stomping grounds. Uh, See if this is I've wrestled with this. I know that the technology is advancing so quickly, and the emerging threats utilizing this technology make it more important that we stay ahead of the technological curve. But I found that it's equally important, maybe even more important, to have a policy that embraces this technology. In other words, how we use the technology, what we in the military would call a capability, is more important than the technology itself. And I don't feel like we're doing enough to really discuss the use of technology and how, at least in my world, the homeland can be secure. You got any thoughts on that? And if I'm wrong, please feel free to tell me.
No, you are right on target. And so let me give you a couple thoughts on that. I was on the board of an organization down at Oak Ridge National Lab, and we would go down there about once a quarter. The board would meet, and we'd be told about all the technologies. And it was interesting. I mean, they had some just terrific technologies that they were thinking about and working to mature. And you would ask the people who were working on the bench, you'd say, so how can these technologies be used? And invariably, the scientists were a bit challenged to be able to talk about the use cases. And then you turn around and you say, so how could this technology be misused? And again, they were very challenged. And I think, when we start to see that a technology is beginning to mature, when it's gone beyond the basic science, I think that's the point in time at which we should be doing and evaluating the use and the misuse cases that are coming out in order to ensure that if we need to have policies and regulations and standards and norms of behavior, that we should be thinking about those co-development with the technology. Because if we don't do that, we're going to continue to be surprised. I can give you a laundry list of technologies that have been surprising to us. I'll just use one as a case in point. We had drones, unmanned aerial systems that were flying in and around airport airspace, and that had been going on for almost a decade before the Federal Aviation Administration had even put out its commentary on regulations for the drones, unmanned aerial systems that weighed under 55 pounds. That's pretty startling when you think about the damage that could be done if one of those got pulled into an engine or, hit the fuselage of an aircraft. And, that's the kind of thing that we should have foreseen. Likewise, I think one other one I'll just tick off and note is, we probably should have understood much more about both cyber and social media. The fact that cyber, the domain, and the early internet really wasn't created with security in mind. It was all about information sharing. And the question is, should we have known, should we have been able to better discern what the potential was for ill effects? And so I think that, that just gives you a couple points that say that we really need to do better at thinking about these issues. long before they become problems. And that's part of what I hope this new department would do.
Thank you, Dan. I agree. By the way, your desk is dusted and cleaned, ready for your return.
Thank you.
Other questions?
Dan, this is Matt Cochran. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, I can.
Yeah, as we talk through this, we talk about the foresight and, doing the horizon scanning, being able to protect what could be, developing the major vulnerabilities. But, how do we do some of this without really harming innovation? Arguably, I mean, so much can happen at a maker level. Tech is democratized, access and ability to influence, make changes, whether it's to, genomics or just, playing with an FPGA or whatever that is. So there's a lot of potential there, obviously, a lot of innovation. That will arguably continue to happen no matter what anybody does, as long as the tech is out there. And so how do we create this scheme that can be, I guess, is both effective and protective, but not stifling?
Yeah, I think that's a really great point. And another set of issues that I deal with in the book is how can one ensure that we're not stifling innovation? There are actually use cases where we have stifled innovation. I talked about the space race. And if you look at the history of space in our country, we at one point decided that we were going to limit export controls. And by limiting export controls, and because internationally there was such a call for space technologies, what it did was it caused people to go offshore, to go away from the United States and develop their own indigenous programs or find another partner to help them with their space needs, whether that's for ground terminals or for small satellites. And so what I think we have to do is be very, very careful about not putting the hammer down too hard, but understanding that there are opportunities to ensure that as technologies get developed, that we're developing not only proper countermeasures, but we're developing them in such a way that they will be friendly to humankind. And let me give you one example in the today we're facing, and that's artificial intelligence. Why is it so important that the US lead in artificial intelligence? And here I would say, because if we want to have an artificial intelligence platform or platforms that are friendly to US values and to humankind, then we are going to want to ensure that we are developing a platform that makes sure that the goals and the values are embedded in it. That's really the key. And so if, we want to ensure that we have technologies that, are going to fit into something that assists society and not, does damage to society, that's the kind of thing we need to think about. I would also say, as we're thinking about questions like export controls and how much to limit proliferation, and I think the North Korea example tells us quite a bit about our ability to limit. You mentioned the D word, democratization, and I agree 100% with that. In addition, all technologies are dual use. We've seen the de-skilling of technologies. And all this means that more people are going to have access to them. So can we actually export or control our way out of this proliferation? And my answer is probably not. So one of the things I talk about in the book is not just trying to have export controls. You have to have some sort of control mechanisms, understand what the issues might be. But it argues for going faster. it argues for developing countermeasures at the same time that you're developing the technologies. It calls for, if you're developing a technology and what you want to do is go faster and cycle through generations more rapidly. And that brings us, into an interesting area. I'll just pick on the aircraft, the F-35. But, when you look at the F-35, the question I would ask is, what is the future going to look like for that? The F-35 was actually created as a concept in 1986. Its first flight was in 2006, and it's expected to be in the force until 2070. And I guess, with that kind of longevity, the question is, is that what we want, or would we prefer to have a fit for purpose or a different type of capability besides a manned aircraft? And so as we think about cycling through technologies and being more agile, there are ways in which we can do that. But in some respects, it takes a bit of transformation of our mindset to think differently about these very vexing operational problems and how best to solve them. I'll pull out a quote by Henry Ford. He actually didn't make this, but he when asked, if do you ever ask the customer what they want, and he came back with, if I asked the customer, that it told me they wanted a faster horse, not a car. And so I guess along those lines, I would say we need to think a bit differently about our technologies and how rapidly we change out our technologies to try to continue to lead in key areas where we think it's important to do so.
I guess along these lines, do you think there's an arms control solution to avoiding the most damaging aspects of this tech war?
Well, look, if at its root, arms control is really about affecting behaviors or technologies or the combination that we feel is troubling. So when you think about even the earliest types of arms control agreements, and those that we think about quite a bit are the nuclear arms control agreements. Those are all based on trying to prevent certain aspects of nuclear deployments. Initially we were seeking to have, the ability to limit the numbers of warheads and to have confidence building measures so that we would have confidence that the other side was not cheating. And when we look at something like the Biological and Toxin Weapons Convention, it eliminates an entire class of potential weapons, that is biological weapons. The Chemical Weapons Convention does the same for chemical weapons, although it's not unequivocal norm. We have other types of ways in which we do that. Coalitions of the willing that mimic arms control. Things like the Missile Technology Control Regime, which tries to limit exports of missile technology that could be used to transport nuclear weapons and certain classes of aircraft and missiles. So, do I think there's an arms control part to this, to controlling technologies? Absolutely. And we need to incorporate them where they make sense, but we also need to realize that we may not always be able to get an arms control agreement. You look at something, this wasn't a treaty per se, but you look at the JCPOA on the Iran agreement, and we had if you will, an arms control like agreement. And for a variety of reasons, it didn't hold up. And right now, it does not appear there's any way in which it could be resurrected just based on facts on the ground and how things have changed. But it is useful to consider what sort of controls, of which export controls and arms control are some of the ways in which we could do so. So yes, I think there is a role for these types of controls within technology, science and technology proliferation.
Right. Other questions? Just to give you a little fair warning, folks, we're at about the 20-minute left time, so I've got a question coming from Nico Allen. Go ahead, please.
Of course, I can't hit my mute button. Hey, Dan, good to be hearing from you today. I was excited to be able to tune in today, and I'm glad that I did. For folks that don't know, Dan is working with us in emerging risk and technologies on the emerging technology and risk analysis, and I'm honored to be doing so. I'm overwhelmed with the experience that he's bringing with us and his past positions and his wealth of knowledge. And I think I'm in a key place to be able to learn from him. So I'm excited about that. But the question that I have is, how realistic do you think it is for us as, DHS and the U.S. as a whole to aspire to not just keep up with emerging technologies worldwide, but to also maintain our position of dominance and of innovation in such a rapidly changing paradigm that we seem to be living through. I mean, just the challenge of not just keeping up with what other people are doing, but for us to remain a leader.
Yeah, well, first, thanks for those very kind words at the beginning. We're thrilled to be working with S&T on this project. I think it's just terrific to think about emerging tech and risks and how to, possibly deal with some of these issues. You know, I guess what I would say is that, when we think about the proliferation of various technologies that are out there, we are not going to be able to be the global leader in absolutely every aspect of every type of technology system that's out there. Let me give you a perfect example of where we in the United States, the US government, has to be a better consumer. And I'll use the concept of semiconductors. And by semiconductors, I want to think about these high-end semiconductors, many of them used for government purposes, but also for areas like high-performance computing. And why do I bring up semiconductors? Well, if you look at a map of where semiconductors are actually developed, it isn't in a single country. You actually have to look and you have to say, well, the leader, for example, in a lot of the early IP type of work that is developing the chips is actually in the United States. When you look at where the specialized equipment is made, some of that is made in the United States, but it turns out the Netherlands has terrific, very exquisite capabilities for areas such as lithography, which allows you to print on the wafers. And other countries have a very significant capability in dealing with these wafers, which are very, very small and thin, 2 nanometer types, it's extraordinary to get to that scale. And when you look at the manufacturing, that manufacturing is often and largely done in Taiwan at the Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Company, TMSC. And when you look at who does the validation of those chips, it's another country, Malaysia. And so it's not as though you can say to yourself, we're going to reshore everything about semiconductors and be successful. Rather, we have to have coalitions that help us be successful, that allow us the freedom to lead where we can, collaborate where we should and must, to then be a leader, be the leader in semiconductors, along with the team that we have established. You cannot any longer attempt to do all these technologies on your own and be the single leader. It's just incomprehensible. Even though the United States is the #1 country in terms of R&D spending at almost $700 billion a year, even with that spending, it's just not going to be possible to lead in everything to include the subsystems. And I think that's really important that we not only understand, but embrace and work to ensure that we're building those coalitions. So that's just one technology, but there are a host of these technologies. We could do this with every single technology, decompose them into their elemental parts and identify areas where we're having to import capabilities or collaborate. There are some dangerous areas, though. You know, one of the dangerous areas that has surfaced is when we talk about rare earths. And we're overly dependent on China. And so in some areas, we can't depend on the supply chain and we need to find new approaches. And there, we're trying to reshore some of the rare earth materials to the United States. We're also trying to collaborate better with partners, great partners like Australia. And so all of that has to be done in concert to collaborate to make sure that we protect our economic prosperity as well as our national security.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. I appreciate that.
Dan, this is Matt Cochran again here from CBTS, and I just I think what you suggest about coalition building really resonates. What I was about to ask was kind of about multinationals having, I think, an important place in some of these globe spanning, the production of technology, the R&D, and how can that be? They're really important for innovation all at once, but how do we kind of keep a lid on what could be dangerous or otherwise when indeed it's kind of produced as part of an already global corporation, that's expanded, perhaps developed talent elsewhere, chased markets. I mean, that's a constant argument with China. So coalition building and keeping your friends and maybe some enemies close sounds reasonable, but you have other comments on that?
Well, yes. I mean, look, I think that all of that's very important. There's also opportunities for, like when I was in government, we had in DHS, we had 13 bilateral relationships with close friends and allies. And we would trade some of our nation's most sensitive secrets with those. And, the amazing thing, I'll just give you one anecdote. The country we were actually doing the most collaborative research and development with was Sweden. And Sweden had some extraordinary capabilities. We were using them to help us understand, for example, in terms of a pathogen called Francisella tularensis or rabbit fever, which would make a biological weapon if employed in such a way. They have done a tremendous amount of research on that particular pathogen. Why? They're not trying to weaponize it. It's endemic in their country. And so, it shows you that by dealing with a country that has a natural capacity there, we were able to improve our own capabilities. We worked so closely with the Netherlands. Why? Because we were interested in flood prevention and mitigation. And they have extensive knowledge of and experience with these kinds of capabilities. And so, dealing with a partner nation, and even nations that maybe aren't as close as the two I've just named, and not as close as some of, say, the Five Eyes, but still finding those partners and finding common areas to work is really essential. We had a great partnership with Singapore on the containers that fit into the belly of aircrafts for blast protection. We had a collaborative program with them on those types of blast protection mitigation capabilities. So, finding those and bringing them forward and resourcing them is very important.
Yeah. So what I'm hearing though, with respect to multinationals, is perhaps the state-to-state relationship building probably, obviously can translate over into the presence of those companies and their activities and markets. Because I know
Absolutely.
yeah, because there was concern on the chips and, the semiconductor manufacturing equipment about our trading partners kind of circumventing U.S. directed regulations on sales of certain technologies to China more recently. They're friends, and so anyway, it's
Well,
interesting.
so can I comment on that last piece? Because I think it's really important. Just like even with China, I do not propose making China like another Cold War. I propose that, the United States and China are the two largest economies, and we need to find ways to work with each other and do it in a way that is mutually beneficial, but also protects each other's prerogatives. And, to the extent that China has been using unfair trade and IP practices, we should call them out on that. And where necessary, we should go to the World Trade Organization and to the World Intellectual Property Organization and hold them accountable. But to the extent that we can find areas to collaborate on to our mutual benefit, we should also think about those.
Thank you. Good point.
Great, thanks. All right, we're about 8 minutes out. I don't want to go over, so if folks have questions they'd like to ask Dan, this is a good time.
This is Dee Parker. Can I just ask one quick question? It shouldn't take long.
Please
just
do.
Just a step further. What do we do to attract, our young folks, whether they are in middle school, high school, or maybe you can get some insight on when they go to college, what they can study to kind of get into this field so that so we can maybe make those changes when it comes to innovation or get some new talent. Like we also know that, it's not a lot of females in this area,
Yeah.
but just trying to figure out what, as a whole, what we can do as a community to try to uplift or to steer them in the right direction, or what they could do in this field.
Yeah, Dee, thanks so much for that question. That's one of the areas I have a chapter in the book that I talk about investing in people. And part of that is figuring out how to incentivize the workforce. And along with that, reimagining our future workforce. When you look at the combination of things like robotics and autonomy and artificial intelligence, it's pretty clear that the workforce of today is probably not going to have any or much relationship to the workforce of the future. And finding those areas and incentivizing those people and, bringing in those people who are interested in science, technology, education, and math, that's great. And then even doing work to try to get down lower and lower into the elementary schools, into the junior high schools, certainly the high schools. A decade ago now, we were all excited because we were finding out that high schools were now doing DNA manipulation. They were able to do the sequencing, and that's terrific. But becoming scientifically literate, getting your technology passport, if you will, needs to be done as early as possible and become part of the learning process. People will learn better if they're exposed to the technology and are able to infuse it at an earlier point in their academic careers, in their lifetimes. Along with that, so this can be a little bit sensitive, but I'll just say it that immigration is also key. About a third of all of our Nobel Prize winners in the United States were not US born citizens. And so attracting people who want to come to the United States, who have these established track records in science, technology, education, and math is absolutely key. The other thing that's key is we have to figure out how to incentivize and bring in more people who have different and varied and exceptional backgrounds in lots of different capabilities. And by this, yes, I am talking most definitely about, finding AI researchers who, come from diverse communities. We had a problem with facial recognition software that was employing artificial intelligence capabilities. And the problem was that it had only really been tried out on a very, if you will, homogeneous population. It tended to be white middle-aged males. And so, we had a lot of problems with accuracy, and that it actually hindered going forward in terms of facial recognition. So if we want to have bad outcomes, not having a good rollout that all the areas have been considered and it's been highly participatory and proven technology will damn the technology right from the beginning. So it's very important that we bring in these different types of populations, different educational experiences, different work experiences, and demographics, and all of that has to come together. It's absolutely essential to our technology future.
Thank you so much.
Great questions, and thank you. We're right at about the end. Probably certainly time for at least one more quick question. One isn't there. I've got one that, but I don't want to take away the opportunity for somebody else to ask. Going once, twice. All right. This is the what's going to be on the exam question. So, having focused on this topic and built the case in the book, what are your key takeaways that you really want readers to grasp?
Yeah, so being a little philosophical just for a second, humanity has never had this much power at our fingertips. In the book, I talk about at the intersection of artificial intelligence, the Internet of Things, and biotechnology, we could actually see that what it means to be human is fundamentally changed. And so with that sort of power, I think it really behooves us to think about how to make sure that that is harnessed for good and not for nefarious purposes. The other thing that I take away from having thought about this is that it would be a mistake to make tech wars, to make these thoughts only about a competition between the United States and China. It is much more than that. It is about how do we advance humanity and ensure that the technologies that we are developing are those that are friendly to humankind, and at least not dangerous to humankind. The other thing I would say in thinking about this is we know how to do innovation. And doing innovation means ideas, it means thinking. And, with the future of work and the ability to outsource to robotics and autonomy and artificial intelligence, many of today's tasks, there are going to be great opportunities to harness those special capabilities that we have always identified with being humans. And, those are things like perception, cognition, judgment. The last point I'd like to make is that, the government, the federal government, does have a role to play in this competition, whether it's a conflict or whether it's a war. And doing so will make sure that we are able to compete and do what needs to be done in order to ensure that the next generation of technologies, again, is friendly to humankind. So I appreciate you asking such great questions and hanging on, and it's been a great dialogue for me, and I always learn so much. So thank you for that.
And thank you. Folks, we're at the end. As I mentioned at the beginning, we've recorded this. We will get an edited version on our YouTube channel as soon as possible. But in the meantime, Dan, thank you again for joining us and for sharing your thoughts on, as someone just mentioned, such an important topic, and one that we're going to be living with for a long time. So thank you, and if we don't hear from you between now and then, enjoy your Thanksgivings. Take care. Bye-bye. Dan, I'll just reach out to you. I'm turning off the recording.